Hello, this is the Global News podcast from the BBC World Service, with reports and analysis from across the world. The latest news 7 days a week. BBC World Service podcasts are supported by advertising.
This is the Global News podcast from the BBC World Service. This is Andrew Peach, and in the early hours of Tuesday the 15th of May, these are our main stories. The White House has blamed the Islamist group Hamas for clashes in Gaza, in which more than 50 Palestinians were killed by Israeli troops. The violence came as the United States formally opened its embassy in Jerusalem, recognising it as the capital of Israel. In other news, it's no longer clear whether the father of the bride will be present when Meghan Markle marries Britain's Prince Harry on Saturday. Also in this podcast,
scientists at Imperial College London have looked at blocking a key protein inside human cells called NMT that cold viruses normally hijack and use to replicate and spread.
Scientists say they may have found a way to cure people of the common cold. The United States has blamed the Islamic group Hamas for the killing of more than 50 Palestinians in Gaza by Israeli forces. A White House spokesman said Hamas had cynically urged people to engage in violence. The deaths, including several children, occurred during violent protests against the opening of a new United States embassy in Jerusalem. The Palestinian President, Mahmoud Abbas, called the deaths in Gaza a massacre. This has been the bloodiest day since 2014.
Today we will enter there, and I will erect my tent there to make these Israelis angry. And I will send a message to Trump.
I got injured on the border, and even with my injuries I returned to the separation fence. We aren't scared of their snipers, not even of their tanks.
I say to Trump and to all the countries who support him transferring the embassy to Jerusalem that this is a huge mistake. Jerusalem is ours. It's not Israel's nor America's. And God willing, we're coming back to Jerusalem and to our land.
Well, our Middle East correspondent Tom Bateman has been following today's events.
The protests at the Gaza fence followed a familiar form after more than 6 weeks of demonstrations. They came on the eve of the 70th anniversary of what Palestinians see as their dispossession in the conflict that surrounded Israel's creation. Many went to protest peacefully. Others threw stones and burning tyres, and, according to the Israeli military, some placed explosive devices at the fence. Israeli troops used tear gas, rubber bullets and live ammunition. Israel said its aircraft and tanks also targeted military positions belonging to Hamas in the northern Gaza Strip. It accused the Islamist group that controls Gaza of orchestrating violence and attempting to breach the fence to reach adjacent Israeli communities. As the violence unfolded in Gaza, the ceremony began to dedicate the new US embassy at an existing consular building in Jerusalem.
Oh, say does that star-spangled banner...
The Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu evoked 3,000 years of history and the sacred status of Jerusalem to Judaism. President Trump has previously said that his decision is intended to take Jerusalem off the table when it comes to any peace negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians. He spoke in a video message.
For many years we failed to acknowledge the obvious, the plain reality that Israel's capital is Jerusalem. Today we follow through on this recognition, and we extend a hand in friendship to Israel, the Palestinians, and to all of their neighbors. May there be peace.
The Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas announced 3 days of mourning. Despite America's claim to be laying the groundwork for a peace process, the prospect of further bloodshed now seems inevitable.
Tom Bateman reporting. The Director of Medical Aid for Palestinians in Gaza, Fikr Shaltut, described some of the injuries that doctors have been seeing in the hospitals.
It's all types of injury, actually, including head and neck and chest, back, abdomen and pelvis, lower limbs and upper limbs. The majority of the injuries were in the lower limbs, perhaps 1,000 of the injuries. But these injuries was kind of very difficult injuries that, have very small entry point, but the exit is quite huge and cause lots of damages to all tissues and muscles and the bone.
The Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has said that Israel was acting in self-defence in Gaza. He said every nation had the right to defend its borders. Our diplomatic correspondent Paul Adams considers the Israeli actions.
At the end of March, Israel's Defence Minister Avigdor Lieberman said anyone approaching the fence between Israel and the Gaza Strip was putting his life in jeopardy. Since then, almost 100 Palestinians have died, most of them shot by Israeli snipers using live ammunition. Thousands more have been injured. Israel says the protests have been violent, with Palestinians, led and directed by the militant group Hamas, determined to breach the fence and commit acts of terrorism inside Israel. And there is no doubt that some of the rhetoric and tactics used are violent. For Israelis, the prospect of a mass incursion by angry, even vengeful young Palestinian men is genuinely alarming. For Palestinians, the desire to tear down the walls of a place they've come to regard as a prison over decades of bitter history is intoxicating. Some simply want to see what it looks like in the land their grandparents fled or were driven from 70 years ago. But no Israelis have so far been hurt, and there's been no mass incursion. For the Israeli human rights group B'Tselem, hypothetical situations alone cannot justify the use of live fire. In the past, Israeli soldiers have frequently resorted to live ammunition in situations where there did not appear to be any immediate threat to life, and they've done so in the knowledge that they rarely face any legal sanction as a result.
While the events have triggered widespread condemnation, Turkey has accused Israel of a massacre and said the United States should also take responsibility. South Africa withdrew its ambassador to Israel until further notice after what it called an indiscriminate and grave attack. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights said those responsible for the outrageous human rights violations should be held to account. Well, President Trump announced last year that he would move the American embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. The ceremony was held on Monday to coincide with Israel's 70th anniversary. The president wasn't there in person, but was represented at the ceremony by his daughter Ivanka and her husband Jared Kushner.
On December 6th, President Trump was very clear that his decision and today's celebration do not reflect a departure from our strong commitment to lasting peace, a peace that overcomes the conflicts of the past in order to give our children a brighter and more boundless future. As we have seen from the protests of the last month and even today, those provoking violence are part of the problem and not part of the solution.
At the ceremony, the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu had this to say.
Dear friends, what a glorious day. Remember this moment. This is history. President Trump, by recognizing history, you have made history.
A senior Palestinian official, Saeb Erekat, described the moving of the US embassy to Jerusalem as a hostile act against international law, while the Arab League called it shameful. Let's look now at the possible consequences of that American embassy relocation. Mustafa Barghouti is a member of the Palestinian Legislative Council and also sits on the Central Council of the Palestinian Liberation Organization. He's been talking to my colleague Razia Iqbal about the opening of the US embassy.
This move from the side of the administration of President Trump is very bad, and I think it makes the United States complicit and even participant in violating international law, in actually committing a war crime by approving the annexation of occupied territories by force. It also destroys the ability of the United States to be a mediator in any peace process. And now the Israelis are thinking that they got a green light from the Americans to do whatever they want. What we see today is a real massacre. So far, Israel is responding to our peaceful marches. They respond to us with lethal weapons.
Let's start with that first point that you make, that the US is in violation of international law. President Trump would argue that the peace process was moribund, and by taking Jerusalem off the table, he has a plan to re-inject life into a process that was dead.
No, he is substituting the peace between two sides with and enforcing a deal unilaterally with Israel on the Palestinian side, consolidating occupation and the system of apartheid and racial discrimination. He's taking off the table the issue of Jerusalem, the issue of settlements, the issue of refugees. So practically he's saying, I'm fulfilling what the Israelis want.
How are the Palestinians going to respond in the context of what you regard as a violation of international law? If you're saying that the US is now siding with the occupying power, what is it that you can do about the United States breaking those resolutions at the United Nations?
For 25 years, Palestinian Authority relied on Oslo Agreement. It has failed. For 26 years, they conducted negotiations. They have failed. For years, they've relied on the United States to solve the problem. The United States failed us. I think the response should be an alternative strategy concentrating on popular nonviolent resistance, boycott, divestment, sanctions as the best two instruments to force Israel to change its policy.
Mustafa Barghouti with Razia Iqbal. Israelis themselves have long regarded Jerusalem as their capital. And way back in 1980, the Israeli Knesset passed what it called Basic Law, Jerusalem, capital of Israel. But why does it mean so much to the Israelis that President Trump has now moved its embassy to the city? Julian Marshall's been talking to David Keyes, spokesperson for the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu.
What it means is that one of the most foundational and long-standing and axiomatic truths, that Jerusalem is the capital of Israel and it's been the capital of the Jewish people for thousands of years, has been recognized by the world's most powerful country, and that's very meaningful symbolically. And it's also just a meaningful recognition of a simple truth.
You say that despite the fact that the American move has been universally condemned, with a few exceptions.
Well, I think you're going to see that tide change very soon. Several other countries have already made the same declaration, and we're in talks with other countries about doing the same thing. But I don't think that truth is subject to a popularity context of the moment. I think that there are things called facts and truths, and that these matter. I'm standing in Jerusalem right now at the new embassy, and this is the seat of the Israeli government, where the Supreme Court resides, where the Foreign Ministry resides, where the Prime Minister's office resides. So I ask you, where is Israel's capital if not Jerusalem?
Except that the status of Jerusalem was meant to be decided in final negotiations with the Palestinians, and this seems to have preempted that.
Well, I don't think this has preempted anything related to peace. Israel has been calling for direct negotiations with our Palestinian neighbors for quite some time, and unfortunately the answer has been consistently no. I've been with the Prime Minister on literally hundreds of occasions where he's called to meet President Abbas for direct talks. And it has never happened because they said no, no, no. In fact, at the United Nations, the Prime Minister invited President Abbas to come to the Knesset to speak directly to the Israeli people. Of course, he said no to that offer. So it takes two to tango, and I hope that that changes. But so long as the position of the Palestinian leadership is to denounce Israel's very right to exist and to call for the eventual flooding of Israel and to negate the very idea of the State of Israel, it's going to be very hard to make progress on peace.
David Keyes, spokesperson for the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. On to other news now. Scientists say they may have found a way to cure people of the common cold. Researchers from Imperial College in London have tested a treatment that targets the human host rather than the virus itself. The average adult catches 2 to 3 colds each year. Here's our health reporter Michelle Roberts.
Currently, there are no drug treatments that can stop a cold. Painkillers and remedies may ease symptoms, but the virus itself is a tricky drug target. That's because there are hundreds of different strains that are continually evolving. Scientists at Imperial College London have instead looked at blocking a key protein inside human cells called NMT that cold viruses normally hijack and use to replicate and spread. This could stop any cold virus in its tracks if given early enough, laboratory studies suggest. In tests, it worked within minutes of being applied to human lung cells. Scientist Ed Tate says he has high hopes for the treatment.
And by targeting the human host, we are targeting something that cannot change and mutate during infection. So effectively, we think this will be a kind of irresistible way of targeting the common cold.
Safety studies in people could start within 2 years, say the researchers. They're working on making a form of the drug that can be inhaled to reduce the chance of side effects.
Still to come, now scientists can transfer memories between snails. But what does it mean for us?
I don't know if you've seen the movie Blade Runner, but I don't think anytime soon we'll be transferring a life history into a replicant.
More details later. The Catalan Parliament has chosen Quim Torra, who's in favour of independence from Spain, as head of the region's government. The move ends months of political deadlock. During that time, the Spanish government imposed direct rule following Catalonia's unilateral declaration of independence in October. I've been talking to our Europe regional editor Danny Eberhard and asked for more information about Quim Torra.
Well, he's a 55-year-old lawyer and journalist. He's from the same sort of area as Carles Puigdemont. He was actually nominated effectively by Carles Puigdemont, who's the former leader of Catalonia, who was sacked following the declaration of independence back in October. That was a declaration that the Spanish courts said was illegal. Mr. Torra is someone who's been identified as a supporter of independence for a long time. He's seen as a bit of a hardliner. He's not directly affiliated with Carles Puigdemont's immediate party, but he forms part of a wider alliance and was elected to Parliament for the first time in December. So he's a relative newcomer to the parliamentary sphere, but before that he was part of several Catalan cultural activist groups, including Òmnium Cultural. So someone who's known for as an activist primarily.
And how will Madrid handle him?
Well, they are being very cautious. The Spanish Prime Minister, Mariano Rajoy, has said he doesn't like what he's heard so far of what Quim Torra has had to say. One of the things he said in Parliament, there was some extraordinary scenes, he said, long live a free Catalonia, and he's promised to respect the results of the referendum on independence, the illegal referendum on independence last year. So Spain is watching this very closely. They've said that they will uphold the law at all costs. The immediate thing will happen once he is formally nominated and has named his minister. They will remove the emergency measures that they've taken control of, but they have indicated that they might bring these back if necessary, if Quim Torra is deemed to have broken the law at any stage.
Our Europe regional editor, Danny Eberhard. Thousands of women in West Africa have been enslaved by a centuries-old practice which forces girls to live and work with priests in religious shrines for the rest of their lives. Why? To pay for the sins of family members. Brigitte Susu Perenyi was one of those girls until she was adopted by an American man and moved to the US. And 20 years after she was freed, Brigitte went on a journey to try to understand what Trokosi really is and why her family gave her away.
This is Accra, Ghana's capital. When I was 7, I was brought here from neighboring Togo and held in a shrine as part of a practice called Trokosi.
Do you know why you're here?
No. This is a report filmed by an American TV crew in 1997. The reporter is interviewing me at the place I was being held. I was labeled a Trokosi, or a wife of the gods. My uncle had committed adultery, and I was paying for it.
Do you miss your parents?
Yes. On the picture, you can see me wrapped in a piece of purple cloth, sweeping the compound. This was among the tasks I was made to do every day. But this TV report changed everything. An American viewer flew to Ghana to negotiate my release and adopted me. After spending 13 years with him in the US, I went back to Togo to try and trace my birth family. It was amazing to find them alive after all those years. Now that I'm older, I finally feel ready to explore the cultural background of Trokosi. I'm on my way to Ghana's Volta region, where Trokosi is most prevalent. I met a group of Ewe elders to know more about the practice. As I arrived, they were saying prayers and pouring libation to their gods. They tell me that people offer cows and goats as sacrifices to atone for their sins. I asked them if there had ever been human sacrifices.
It depends. Some gods demand humans as sacrifice, not to be killed, but isolated.
He's talking about Trokosi, where you are banished from the community to pay for the crimes of your family. When I left the shrine, there were about 5,000 Trokoshi women and children in Ghana alone. Trokoshi was made illegal in 1998, a year after I was freed. But no priest had ever been prosecuted, and the practice still goes on. It was time for me to visit my family in Ahasome, the village in Togo where I was born.
This is it. And then you call your brother. This is it. On the right. It's right here, on the right.
I had visited a few times, and each time I went, I never found the courage to ask why they give me away, a question that had been on my mind my whole life. This time, I wanted to speak to my dad. I was ready to find out the truth. What had he agreed with my uncle?
Your uncle said he needed you to come run chores in his house.
My uncle lived in the capital, Lome, a long way from my village.
I went to Lome to look for you. Your uncle told me you weren't there. I roamed the streets endlessly and I didn't find you. I came home so frustrated.
Are you aware now where I was taken?
No.
He took me to Ghana, Volta region of Ghana, and I was placed in a shrine. He left me. I was supposed to be there for the rest of my life.
Whatever has happened has happened. I am just happy you are back home. But if you want to blame somebody, you blame me.
You can watch the full documentary by Brigitte Susu-Pereni on the BBC Africa YouTube channel. Now, you may not have known this, but snails have memories, and remarkably, these memories can be transferred, at least according to scientists at the University of California. This is all to do with transplanting genetic material, RNA, from the brain of one snail to another. David Glansman led the team. He's been talking to my colleague Shivani Dave.
The way we trained them was to give them a series of electrical shocks to their tail. And what this does is it produces a very simple kind of learning called sensitization. Basically, enhanced responses to a sudden noxious or arousing stimulus. So from previous research that we'd done in my laboratory, we hypothesized that the memory for this type of learning might be stored in the nucleus of neurons. So the purpose of this experiment was to see if we could transfer the memory by taking ribonucleic acid out of a trained animal and injecting it into the untrained animal.
So what are you going to do with this? What's it all for?
Well, first of all, I'm a scientist. I'm interested in how the world works. So what I'm going to do with it is continue to figure out how the brain works and how memory works. But in a practical sense, there are many disorders of memory. For example, dementias, Alzheimer's disease is the most well-known. And there are also disorders that people don't think of necessarily as disorders of memory, but that's what they are. So post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, is basically turbocharged memory of a painful event. And so with this knowledge, we might be able to develop down the road new treatments for disorders of memory, and those treatments would involve RNA. And so that would be novel, very novel.
Will you be able to transfer any memories, or does it have to be particular ones?
We don't know the answer to that. There'll have to be other people who work on different kinds of memories in different organisms. They will have to try to replicate our results and see how far they can be carried. So, for example, I don't know if you've seen the movie Blade Runner, but I don't think anytime soon we'll be transferring a life history into a replicant.
David Glansman with Shivani Dave. In Britain, Kensington Palace has asked for understanding for Meghan Markle following reports that her father will not now attend her wedding to Prince Harry on Saturday. Thomas Markle is expected to walk his daughter down the aisle at the ceremony at St George's Chapel in Windsor. My colleague Sophie Rayworth asked our royal correspondent Nicholas Witchell, who's at Buckingham Palace, for the latest news.
It's absolutely unclear now whether Thomas Markle will be at the wedding on Saturday, whether or not he will walk his daughter down the aisle as planned. Now, earlier this evening, he told a journalist in Mexico where he lives that he would not be attending the wedding. This was after it had emerged that he had cooperated with a photographer to pose for supposedly snatched but clearly set up photographs of him being measured for a wedding suit, looking at a computer screen of stories about his daughter. These were photographs which sold around the world for significant sums. Now, Mr. Markle is quoted as saying that he didn't make any money out of the photographs, but he wanted to avoid any embarrassment for his daughter. Tonight, after some uncertainty, Kensington Palace issued a statement saying that this was a very personal time for Meghan Markle, and then, on behalf of Miss Markle and Prince Harry, asking for understanding and respect to be extended to Mr. Markle at what they call this difficult situation. Now, I understand that Meghan Markle is distressed, and most particularly she is concerned for the well-being of her father. She is close to her father. He is under intense media scrutiny. He's been described as a rather shy and reclusive figure. He's having difficulty, I think, coping with it. But it is still, I understand, very much Meghan Markle's wish that her father should be there on Saturday to support her.
Our royal correspondent, Nicholas Witchell. And that's all from us for now. There will be an updated version of Global News available to download later. If you'd like to comment on this edition or the stories we included, do send us an email. The address is globalpodcast@bbc.co.uk. My name's Andrew Peach. Thank you for listening, and until next time, goodbye.